Okay, it is now 1:30. Welcome everyone to the Novalyne Price Ellis panel for Howard Days. I'm Bobby Deary, I'm going to be the moderator. And just so we get started with everybody, Novalyne Price Ellis was a school teacher here at Cross Plains. She came to teach in 1934. She is best known as Robbie Howard's girlfriend. She wrote One Who Walked Alone, her memoir of their relationship. This was published in 1986, and in 1996 it formed the basis of the film The Whole Wide World, which starred Renee Zellweger as Novalyne and Vincent D'Onofrio as Robert E. Howard. I'm going to go down the line, and everybody's going to introduce themselves on the panel, and then we'll get started.
I'm Bill Cavalier, and through the good graces of Rusty Burke, I was able to meet and hang out with Novalyne Ellis, and I was a guest in her home, saw the Two Weird Tales books that she received directly from Robert E. Howard, and got to be very friendly with her, exchanged a lot of letters, and she was just a wonderful person.
My name is Michael Scott Myers. I was a student of Novalyne's for 4 years, from 1975 to 1979, down in Lafayette, Louisiana. She was my speech teacher, and I was the one who basically read her book and decided to make a good movie, and we produced The Whole Wide World. I was the screenwriter and co-producer of the film, and that's why I'm here. So I know Novalyne, and that's my background. Thank you.
My name is Patrice Luminet, and other than the name, my story is the exact same as Indy's. I met Novalyne through Rusty Burke, and I got to spend time with her at her home, see exact same thing you did. So, exact same story.
I'm Anya Martin, and unfortunately I have not met Novalyne, but the book was tremendously meaningful for me. I guess professionally, I'm a writer. I have a collection called Sleeping with the Monster from Novalyne Price, and I do the Outer Dark podcast, where contemporary word fiction interviews and panels. In fact, we would love to run this panel if it's being recorded by someone and the panelists would agree. This would be a panel that we'd be very interested in. But I read the book, The One Who Walks Alone, thanks to my father, who was in for stand-ups. My dad was Bill Martin, William C. Martin. Possibly some of you, or any of you might have known him. He came to Robert E. Howard in the 30s when he was growing up, reading the magazines and so forth. And he gave me that book, and he also gave me Black God's Shadow by Seymour. Yes. And so these books were tremendously meaningful for me, and I can talk about them. I also did some work for Wandering Star, for Marcelo Anciano, and Michael, I interviewed you. I did a phone interview with you. You may or may not remember, I also interviewed Dan Ireland and Vincent D'Onofrio. Unfortunately, whatever Marcelo was going to do with those interviews never happened, but I still have the interviews. So that's something that maybe someday they'll see print or something and say more.
Okay, so let's just start with some background. Novalyne Price was born to Etna Reed and Homer Price in Bangs, Texas, which is very near Brownwood. And her parents divorced when she was still young. The mother remarried and then divorced again around 1930. But she grew up in and around Brownwood. That's where she had a lot of family, and she went to the local high school. She was 2 grades behind Robert E. Howard, but she knew many of the same people. They had friends in common, and she dated some of the friends in common. And it was very unusual at the time for someone to seek education like she did. At a very young age, she started taking speech classes. And when she could no longer afford those on her own, her mother decided to pay for her speech lessons, and then she started at the age 13 to tutor other people so that she could further her education, because money was tight. And she ended up graduating high school and then going on to Daniel Baker College. And she worked her way through college at a time when that was not common for women to do. And when she did finally graduate from college with her degree, she went into one of the few fields that was open to women at the time, which was school teaching. And she taught in many small towns around Abilene. This is a memoir of teachers that were at Zephyr, which is a very small town, and it's got a picture of Novalyne in it and a little section that she wrote. This is reproduced in the selected letters of Novalyne Price Ellis at the back. James Reasoner discovered this many years ago. But so when she came to Cross Plains in 1934, two of her cousins, the Guathmes, were already teaching at Cross Plains High School, and they let her know there was an opening in the English department. So she came in, and they elected, all right, you can work for us, but you have to imagine what it's like to be a woman alone, an educated woman, probably one of the most educated women in town at that point, with aspirations to be a writer, and you're in a stifling little Texas town. She goes on about it in one of the opening chapters of One Who Walked Alone. They tell the teachers at the orientation what they cannot do. All the women have to live in town. All the women have to go to church in town. All the women have to go to church. The women cannot drink. The women cannot smoke, because the kids will see them smoke. And they accept that the men will smoke, but they can't tell them not to. But the women better not smoke. And you really get the impression that all of the morals of the 1930s were trying to make her in this prim and proper schoolmarm image. And she didn't want any of it. But she was dedicated to teaching. She was a tremendous teacher. She did a huge number of extracurricular activities in town. She was running the debate club, the drama club, she was grading papers, and she was still trying to write, and somewhere in there, she had the opportunity to date Robert E. Howard. But let's hear from some of the people that actually met her. So, Indy, why don't you start us off?
Well, I was lucky enough to meet Novalyne when we all got together in the 1988 WorldCon. It was NOLACon in New Orleans, and Rusty had invited Novalyne to come to that convention to give a speech about her friend Robert E. Howard. And I was lucky enough to be included in the small group that went down to visit her the night before. And we're sitting there chatting about Robert E. Howard, and I look over on the sideboard that was right there, and it said, "My speech about Robert E. Howard." Now it took all the forces in the world to stop me from just taking a little peek at that. And she Novalyne gave a wonderful speech at WorldCon about her friend Robert E. Howard. It is reprinted in Day of the Stranger, and it's just a wonderful memory of him. She was always very concerned what other people thought of him. After she read what was written about him earlier, she took issue with that, and of course, Novalyne was the only living person that ever went out with Robert E. Howard, or that hung out with him, if you will. And fortunately, after the speech, the next day she came down into the lobby of the hotel, and there must have been 30 people around having her sign her book. And then I was lucky enough, Rusty invited me to go with him when he drove her back home to Lafayette from New Orleans. I got to ride along. I rode shotgun. And of course, we talked at great length in the car. And me being who I am, well, I had to ask her a few questions. I asked her about, I read that Robert E. Howard was you know, he talked about how he and his friends got boisterously drunk and went out and shot up signs in the countryside and all that. I said, did he ever mention any of that to you? She said, well, no, but I wouldn't expect him to tell me about that. And I asked her, do you ever read any Robert E. Howard? And she said, no, because I hear him talking, which was, you know, pretty heartfelt and, you know, heart-wrenching, actually. But eventually I got comfortable enough talking with her. I asked her, was Robert E. Howard a good kisser? And she said, oh, yes. And this is with her husband, Bill, sitting right next to her. But he certainly understood her notoriety and her newfound fandom, and so it was all right. But I drew the line at asking about kissing. I didn't ask about anything else. And that's pretty much it. You know, I was fortunate enough. She was just a wonderful soul, a gentle lady, and very, very concerned about what people thought about Robert E. Howard. She wanted to make sure that everybody knew him for the wonderful, good man that he was, the gentle soul that he was. So that's part of what I got to say about Novalyne.
I'd like to add at this point that throughout her life, Novalyne was always much more than Robert E. Howard's one-time girlfriend. She was a dedicated educator. All her life, she worked mostly in the Louisiana state school system and then for some private schools. She did tutoring. She was hugely influential in the National Forensic League, debating, amateur theatrical. She wrote some of her own plays. When we talk about Day of the Stranger, this was written in 1947 for a school assignment. She was doing graduate work at Louisiana State University, and she had recalled an instance after Robert E. Howard's death. She was in Dallas, and she saw someone that for a moment she thought was Bob. And because she had only heard about his death by telegram for 1 minute, she thought, what if he was really alive? What if it was all fake? What if he was still there? And of course it wasn't. And that play was later published in the Radio Player's script book in 1949, and it was then published by Necronomicon Press. This is unfortunately long out of print. We'd like to do another print, but you know, we gotta get permissions for everything first. But we should all appreciate how dedicated she was as a school teacher, and we have one of her students here.
Yeah, in 1975, I went to Cathedral Carmel High School, and I was coming from the public school system and thrown into a Catholic school, relatively small Catholic high school environment. And not many electives at that point, but one of the electives was speech, and I decided to be in speech, take speech. And I walked into the room the first day, and I see this elderly lady, because at this point Novalyne had retired from Lafayette High, where she was teaching, and was now, like a lot of teachers do, kind of teaching in retirement at a private school. And I walked in, and I noticed, the first thing I noticed was the desk was not in front of the classroom. It was in the back of the classroom, and with the seats around it. So as a speech coach, you have to get up in front and talk, and and talk to the audience, which is the class. But it was also very good because she could watch everybody in the classroom without you having to turn around and see what she was doing. Because if you turned around and see what she was doing, she could see you doing it. So it was also a very good disciplinary effect to do in the classroom for students as well. But she commanded the classroom, so there was never any hooliganism or disrespect or anything like that. All 4 years, I never saw her raise her voice, never saw anyone raise her voice back at her, and even after school, because I started as a debate student and then did some oratory. So that was my extracurricular activities after school. And we did pretty well. We were a pretty good debate team for a small Catholic school in Louisiana. And we actually went to nationals, and her nickname was Navi. That was what we called her behind her back. But we always had to wear suits. We couldn't go to a speech tournament. A lot of these teams would go to speech tournaments, and after competition, you'd see everybody in jeans. That didn't happen to us. We were in suits all day, all the time. The only time you weren't in a suit is maybe if you got back to the hotel. That's it. You were always well dressed and professional, as they say. But she was an amazing teacher, and even after she was about to retire, I asked her, I said, well, because I was there her last year in 1979. I said, what are you going to do now? And she goes, well, I'm working on a book. I'm like, oh yeah, what's the book about? She would simply said, it's about the guy who wrote the Conan stories. And I was like, what? Because I was familiar with Conan. I had bought some comic books early on, and some of the Marvel stuff, probably 1972, 73. So I had a collection of, I don't know, probably 15, 16, 17. And it perked my interest. I'm like, really? Okay. So I let it go at that, and one of my good friends, Ben Mouton, who's actually in the movie, plays Clyde Smith, that summer took her on the research tour, drove up to Cross Plains and met Truett Vincent and Clyde, and she started writing her book, and 5 years later it was published, and she sent it to me when I just moved out to California. So I read it the first time and read about 40 pages and put it down because I thought it was just so dry, whatever. And about 7 months later, I saw the movie A Room with a View. I'm like, man, it was a really good movie, and there wasn't a lot of people in it. It was a period piece. I'll pick up that book again and check it out. This time I got through it, I'm like, there's something here. And when I was home, I went over to her house. I said, I think I'd try and make this into a movie. Will you option the book to me? She says, sure. So I paid her $20, optioned the book, and started working on the script. This is around 1989, 89, I'm guessing, 90. And that's how it all started.
Best $20 you ever spent.
That's $20 I ever spent.
Let's talk about One Who Walked Alone for a minute. When Novalyne died in 1999 at the age of 91, her obituary said that she'd written 4 novels, and the only one that was published was One Who Walked Alone. Well, that wasn't quite true. She did write several books that were not published, but she also wrote A Family History, In Search of Tomorrow, The Westward Movement of the Landrum Family, which was self-published in 1984. She wrote a textbook for speech, which was also published. She did Day of the Stranger and a few other things. She claimed to have written a handful of stories that were published, but we don't know where they were published or when, so that's a little tricky. So when we talk about what she's written, we're mostly looking at Day of the Stranger and One Who Walked Alone. And One Who Walked Alone is developed from her diaries, her journals that she kept from 1934 to 1936. But they're not exact transcripts. She rewrote them, she copied them, she edited them, and then when she finally got the manuscript in a place where it could be published, the publisher asked her to cut about 100 pages. Patrice, you know something about that. Did you want to talk about it?
What do I know about that?
Her diaries.
Yes. So the question of the fate of the original diaries it's a bit of a mystery today. So she said at some point that she had destroyed them. Do I believe that? I don't. Honestly, I still hope the original diaries are somewhere. I know that they would be in her house, but so far they haven't been recovered. So as Bobby was just telling you, we are missing a lot of stuff. So Don Grant had her cut, the publisher, Don Grant had her cut about 100 pages worth of material, which was mostly about cross-planes, not about our relationship with Howard. One thing which I guess you did the same, so that. So one of the few, I mean, I read that book I don't know how many times. So it begins and you have a date in August, it says August 1934, and you say next Thursday, so next Friday, so you take a calendar and try to follow the date. And at some point, it just doesn't add up. So something which is supposed to be taking place on November 1934, and all of a sudden you realize, oh, this is already January 1935. So we are missing, there's a lot of stuff that's missing there, lots of info, so maybe some of it is not relevant. Maybe she decided that she would not publish everything. Remember when she wrote that, her husband was still alive. And I remember whoever asking her, so was Bob Howard the love of your life? And she replied, no, I married the love of my life. But obviously, I guess, was it Bill?
Bill,
Yeah, so Bill was, yeah, Bill was not, I guess you can imagine his reaction if she had written everything and published everything in that book. He probably wouldn't have wanted to read what was happening with Bob in 1934 and 1935. So hopefully one day, one of these days, we'll be in a position to recover the diaries. Hopefully they still exist, and be able to publish them, maybe not now, but a few years down the road. And I've been working on that.
Trish, you've been working with Novalyne's son, Marvin.
That's it. I'm in touch with her son, Marvin. So he usually comes every year. This year he couldn't make it, but this years really has been telling me that, okay, one of these days I'm going to do that. And hopefully he will come around and do it and find the stuff we're missing.
For all that we were talking about her diaries, some people might wonder how much of it might she have added in afterwards. But the thing is, when she published that in 1986, and it took about 3 years to get from the final manuscript to publication, there wasn't a lot written about Robert E. Howard. Elsbeth de Camp's biography of Howard, with all of its flaws, had not been published yet. And some of it was based on interviews they had given to, that Novalyne had given to the de Camps. How many people have picked this up today? Okay. This has about a dozen letters that Novalyne published in various fanzines here and there over the years. After I got this to press, Rob Ream sent me about 80 letters from Novalyne to Glenn Lord, which are transcribed here, talking about her process of writing the damn book. And this might get published at some point if I can get permission, but one of the issues she had was with the camps, because she had given these interviews to them, and she was concerned they were going to use her material to present Bob in a way that she did not agree with, to twist her words to fit their image of Robert E. Howard. And one thing that I think One Who Walked Alone does very well is present her vision of Robert E. Howard, but she also presents life in a small town, life as a teacher. She herself is the protagonist of the novel. This is her story, but she is not an ideal protagonist. She presents herself as a bit young, very headstrong, she makes mistakes, and you can see those mistakes in greater context when you know about Robert E. Howard's life, and there are details in the book she could not have necessarily known would be confirmed in Robert E. Howard's letters because those weren't published yet. Anya?
Hold on one second. You've used the word novel twice. Do you need to use the word novel?
It's a memoir.
It is a memoir, but it's narratively structured like a novel. You have to remember, these are not her straight diaries. She rewrote these things for publication to have more of a narrative flow. And that's more obvious once you read her letters. But I think that she comes through very strongly in this, and I think it comes through great in the 1996 movie. I think Renee Zellweger really hit it. But Anya, you have a better perspective on this than we do because we're all guys. What do you feel like?
Well, I wanted to say, when I read this book because this was a woman writing about Robert E. Howard, and I actually, I'm a woman, I actually like Robert E. Howard too, as there are many women in this audience, it's sort of a fallacy that Sword and Sorcery could not appeal to me. So I read it because my dad gave it to me because of that, but I was immediately impressed by how much it reminded me of that kind of book about a young woman who wants to be a writer. This kind of, if you've seen the film My Brilliant Career, which was based on a novel written by it's the autobiography of Miles Franklin, set in Australia. You've read that, you've seen that, or you've read Anna Green Gables, who aspired to be a partly autobiographical story by Lucy Maud Montgomery, who also wrote for Weird Tales. As you see, I felt immediately this was that genre. This is a young woman in a small town in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the edge, whether it's in Texas or Australia or in Canada, in Prince Edward's Island, who is struggling to find her way as a writer. And I was absolutely enjoyed and was intrigued by the information of Robert E. Howard, but I was not bored or not interested in the rest. And I liked her portrayal of herself, all of that, as being kind of, she was trying to fit in to be a teacher. Lucy Maud Montgomery also was a teacher. In the Anna Green Gables, it's the same story in a way. And I feel like it was the story of many young women who aspired to be writers and who had limited opportunities and career opportunities. They became teachers, and they had crazy, wild imaginations. So you can see a young woman like this being drawn to someone like Robert E. Howard, who had this kind of crazy, wild imagination, and also was, to her, a successful writer. Even if he was writing for the popes, he was the person that she knew. She immediately wanted to meet the writer in the community. So for me, that was my experience reading the book. So I immediately wanted to read that book, and I can't remember if the word was I read it in the late 80s or early 90s, so yeah, I might have known that the movie Whole Wide World was coming. It might have been that I read it before knowing that the movie was coming. I remember when the movie was coming, or I think I read about it. I told my dad, and we were just talking about how weird it was that there was going to be a movie about Robert E. Howard, how unlikely that would be a movie, and so that was something that I could share with my dad as well, with it. But I love the book, and I think that if you know a young woman who also likes science fiction and fantasy, that's a great book to recommend to them to read as well.
Okay, so the other half of this panel is Novalyne Price's influence on Robert E. Howard. And this is a bit of a contentious subject, because if you read Howard's letters in the collected letters from the Foundation Press, Novalyne is not mentioned very often. She's mentioned in passing, not by name, in 2 letters to H.P. Lovecraft, and that's about it. And that kind of makes sense when you think about the time frame, because anybody that he would have been corresponding with that knew Novalyne, he could have just talked to. If he wanted to talk with her about Truett Vincent or Thomas Clyde Smith, he didn't need to write a letter necessarily. They could have just gone and had a chat. And they probably did have a chat in 1935 during that trip to New Mexico and back. But as far as the literary influence that she had on him, well, Patrice, what do you think?
With the exception of one story, which I guess I will discuss later, I think that there was absolutely no influence whatsoever of Novalyne on the stories. So I know that my good friend in the strongly disagrees. So I guess the point that people would like to make is, yeah, but look at Red Nails. So we have this strong woman, Valeria, and she's obviously patterned after Novalyne, to which, before you have a chance to reply, I will add Sure, but if you look at the stories Bob had written before that, before he met Novalyne, I'm thinking of Queen of the Black Coast. I'm thinking of especially The Shadow of the Vulture, Dark Agnes, the first Dark Agnes story, The Frost Giant's Daughter. So we have here a writer who was interested in creating strong women character. And then one day he meets Novalyne, so for me the inference is obvious. The writings of Bob inspired his choice of woman.
And I can certainly agree with that, my fine French friend. There's a few stories that Howard came up with after 1934. One of them is he created a character named Gloria Willoughby in one of the El Barak stories. She was a very strong woman, and I remember writing a review of the story, and one of the first things I said about the story, one of the first things that impressed me about the story is I wrote, Gloria Willoughby is Novalyne Price Ellis. Another example would be Yasmina from Daughter of the Early Khan, a strong woman, but she needed El Barak's help. So you have Novalyne, who maybe needed Robert E. Howard's help about writing.
That's quite a stretch.
Hey, I'm all for stretching it out here with you, pal. And another totally obvious one in the Breckenridge Elkin series, Glory McGraw. Glory McGraw was a school teacher. Mic drop.
Can I say something? I'm going to say something sort of in between. I think the fact that he had someone to drive around and have conversations with and talk about writing, whether she shows up as a character or not, perhaps she had. I think when you have somebody who's interested in your writing, and the way that women do influence writers is not necessarily so linear.
Yeah.
Having somebody who is enthusiastic about your writing and right there, not just somebody you're writing letters to, might, on its own subtle level, have had an influence that is completely, maybe, I don't know. Did he write anything that came out of those conversations or just her being there and being part of his life? Was he a little more cheerful? He'd suffered from depression. So was he a little bit happier when he was with her and so therefore inspired to write? So it could be, if she hadn't been in his life, there could have been still a difference in his writing, an impact of some kind of subtle way.
So I guess it's time we started speaking about Daughters of Feud. So we're in the church, so I apologize, but in 1935, late 1935, the relationship between Bob and Novalyne was reaching its end, really. They were fighting, and at that point in his life, Bob's mother's health was declining, and he was forced to write stories to sell, to make quick bucks. And he started writing spicy stories. So if you don't know what spicy stories are, they were written for a line of pulp magazine that specialized in erotic stories. And one of them, which went unsold in his lifetime, the hero is in love with a school teacher, and stuff go bad between them. At some point, the school teacher has to spank the school teacher. It was simply the situation in verse. So yes, I think in that story, I know that you like spanking yourself. But for
Promise
me,
you wouldn't tell.
but in that story, yes, clearly you can see that he's fuming about something and he's simply lashing out, if I may, and spanking. Thanks for following me. About, yes, this relationship which is going bad.
Well, you know, good or bad, he was writing about her. My opinion.
Absolutely.
Y'all have read more Howard than I, because when I was doing the research for the movie, I was reading all the Conan stuff and stuff at that time period. When I was reading all the Conan stories, Valeria burst out at me like, wait a minute, here's a story about Conan, and there's this woman, Valeria, is equal, out of the blue. And I think that doesn't come out of nowhere, you know, and that was around the time he was with her.
Yes, exactly.
And I'm like, okay, this is a warrior woman and Conan. Now, we've had belief as side characters, but, you know, she's like fighting and kind of, she's like a barbarian woman who's, I'm like, that's significant.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
And that's, to me, I mean, I think you're right too, but I mean, that's where I think it comes in. Because I noticed it, and I wasn't even an expert. I'm like, this story's different. Like, who is this Valeria character coming out in this story when it looks nothing like the other stuff from the outset of the story? And so that's what I think is the closest for, and it was when they were in the good times.
Yes, there's a lot of banter going on
Right.
between them at the beginning of the story.
Because, you know, she didn't cut any slack for Robert. I mean, she set him straight on a bunch of stuff. And I think that was like, whoa, what? You know, where's this coming? And it had an impression. I firmly believe that.
Yeah, I think that's what I write in the afterword to the third Conan volume, and I said that it's possible to read Red Nails as a story of Conan and Valeria, who are Bob and Novalyne, going back to the Howard House, which is this decaying house, city, whatever, and yet there's two older people, Tezcala, the vampire, and Olmec. So it's simply Bob and Novalyne trying to, okay, can we deal with those people and the situation? That's one possible reading, obviously.
It is important for all of us to remember that as much as we focus on Novalyne's interactions with Robert E. Howard, their relationship, his influence on her, and her possible influence on him, it is undeniable that Novalyne Price Ellis helped shape the legacy of Robert E. Howard as we know him. Because this is the only full memoir from someone that knew him. All of his other friends, they wrote bits and pieces. You can read little bits on Booth Mooney and Truett Vinson and Tevis Clyde Smith. And these people all had their reminiscences of Robert E. Howard, but none of them knew that side of him, and none of them wrote at this length, in this depth, in this amount of characterization. And so she's really come to dominate Howard's studies in a way, just because this is the most significant source outside of Howard's own letters and records that we have. And
We knew the memoir was good because she kissed him.
But she kissed Clyde and Truett too. She dated all three of them.
Yeah,
They weren't Robert E.
Oh,
Howard.
yeah.
Bill is into kissing and spanking.
but, you know, when we think about Howard's studies as is today, when we think about the legacy of the house and how we think of Howard, a large part of what we're thinking about is either confirmed by her or shaped by her. And her life was not entirely given to Robert E. Howard even after her death. She continued, she married, she had a child, she raised the kid, she had her whole career, she wrote about other things, she had other interests. But at the end, as Robert E. Howard became more famous, and you have to remember, she started this book before the 1982 movie. You know, she was like, oh wait, this whole Conan thing is getting started. She'd already started on the book. She was hoping that the promotion from Schwarzenegger's movie could be helped to move her novel. And she was thinking in that terms. She was thinking of, she was turning her mind back to Robert E. Howard, but she was looking to the future. She was looking to how he would be remembered, how she would be remembered, how people would think of that time, because already the myths about Robert E. Howard had started to congeal. There were people that thought of him as a mama's boy. There were people that thought of him as a freak. There were people in Cross Plains that thought he was just weird. I mean, this guy, he writes. Who writes for a living in Cross Plains in the 1930s? Robert E. Howard. No one else, okay? Everybody else is keeping a book at a store, or they've got a farm, or they're cattle ranching, or they're a teacher in a school. And we need to remember her perspective, because she fought to get where she was. You know, she fought all her life to be a respected teacher and to try to write and to present the truth and an accurate picture of who she was and where she came from, and she was proud of that. And she wanted Robert E. Howard to be remembered as she remembered him as he was, not as somebody from New York who'd never been to Texas might know.
That was the main focus of her interaction with all of her fans, the folks that came down to meet her in the lobby of the hotel. And there were a couple of people that literally showed up with 10 books for her to sign. And Novalyne's greatest concern, like I was saying, was how people would remember her friend Robert E. Howard. That's how she phrased it. He was my good friend. And there was the term that she used was she didn't want to think people to think of Robert Howard as a babe in arms. That you know, he was tied to his mother's apron strings, and he wasn't a man on his own, and he really was, and she respected that, and she wanted that to she wanted to be able to portray him in such a good light to really help with his legacy, and she did. She did amazing things to give all kinds of credit to Robert E. Howard.
One thing I wanted to add is, for me, one of the great qualities of this book, I'm talking about One Walk Alone, is when you read Bob's letters, and you're just reading letters, they're cold, because there's no dialogue, there's nothing, but when you read the book, you get a sense of how he sounded, how he would talk, and then when you get back to the letters after that, I was about to say, you can almost hear his voice. And when you apply that to the letters, to the stories, you get a better sense of the man he was because of the way he talked. I don't know if I'm making any sense or if I'm very clear here, but I can hear him in my head, thanks to this book.
We've got about 15 minutes left. Does anybody on the panel have another subject, or should we go straight to questions? Comments?
We can go to question, but I've got something I can say just that I was thinking about just listening to everybody talk about two small things. The impact of an early relationship. We think you go on and you have a very, very full life, but this phenomenon of somebody having had an early relationship with somebody significant and maybe a pang of regret or, you know, not sure, and then something happens and it's just cut off and, you know, who knows, you know, it's cut off in this case by suicide. I mean, I discovered with my mother that she had a relationship with someone who went on to be famous that I had no real concept of, and how important that was. She was like near suicidal, I guess, when I don't know if she was serious about that, but back in the 1950s. But I know that there was a pang of regret about that I now in the dynamics of even my parents' relationship. And why would something in the 1950s be important 50 years later, that kind of pang of regret or kind of interesting impact of having someone significant in your life? And I don't know if Novalyne felt any regret about that, but certainly she probably imagined she had a lifelong friendship that was cut short. And this was something that stayed with her and is a way of giving him a sense of the immortality or that relationship they didn't have that was robbed from her. So I thought of that as you're talking of, like, in terms of why would she be so stimulated so many years later? Why was this so important to her? You know, and I think that's our hope in finding out about other people too. I mean, I often think, who are all of these other people that we don't know that much about, who are writers that we admire, and maybe there is someone out there with some knowledge and some regret who might tell us something. So I just wanted to say that I thought that was an interesting aspect, you know, of this writing as well.
Absolutely. All right, so we've got time for questions. Gary, I think you had your hand up
Yeah,
first.
I just want to throw it out there. You know, E. Hoffman Price visited Howard twice, so he knew him pretty well, and he wasn't colored by a love or whatever, but his, you know, profile of Howard differs from what most people want a profile of Howard to be. Whereas we lean toward novelist because that makes Howard, I mean, a little more normal. He had a girlfriend, you know, or stuff like that, you know. So, I mean, I can understand the attraction toward Novalyne's book and everything, but I do think we take away a lot of weight from E. Hoffman Price that should be studied as well. That's all.
I did 2 years ago. It's called Cross Plains
Yeah,
Pilgrimage.
I read
You can
it,
get
but-
free copies over at the house. All right. No, very seriously. E. Hoffman Price and Novalyne Price Ellis, no relation, had very different experiences of Robert Howard, and yet they had very similar experiences. I think a lot of people, if they go into One Who Walked Alone, the book, or The Whole Wide World cold, might find Robert Howard a very strange individual. I've known people that really did not like D'Onofrio's performance. I thought it was great, but they thought he was weird. They couldn't see what she saw in him. But this is also something that comes through in E. Hoffman Price, because Robert Howard was a character. He was different. He was a bit of an outsider. He did have some habits and quirks which were not common for Cross Plains, Texas, or any small Texas town in the 1930s. And I don't think we discount E. Hoffman Price at all. I would argue strongly against that, because Price really promoted his own memoir, and he wrote it several times, published it several times in variation, and that's sort of what's different between E. Hoffman Price and Novalyne Price Ellis is E. Hoffman Price learned how to tell his story. If you look at the very earliest versions of his memoir that were written in the 1940s, and you compare it to the last version, which was published after his death in Book of the Dead from Arkham House, he polished that story. All the things that were a little vague and uncertain when he wrote them 10 years after meeting Robert Howard, they're very definite at the end, okay? And that's because he had taught himself to tell those stories. He had dug up details from his memory and said, yes, this is absolutely how it happened. Well, did it happen or not? But at the same time, you got to remember, these were both fairly honest people, and memories can be odd and tricky, but they agreed on certain key aspects of who Robert Howard was, how he acted. You know, there are correspondences between Novalyne's book and E. Hoffman Price's memoirs. So I would encourage you to read both. Next question, I think you?
I have a two-part question. First, what did she think of the movie? And for those of us who aren't familiar with the book, why did their relationship fall apart?
As for the movie, Mr. Myers?
We screened the movie for Novalyne in I think it was in 96. It premiered at Sundance in 1996. And we screened it for her, I want to say a couple of months later, maybe April or May, in Lafayette, at a kind of, I guess it was private screening. And we went to a theater and they screened it for us. We got a print. Dan Ireland came down. He brought his print and screened it. And she liked the movie, or at least she said she liked the movie. I mean, it's so hard to know exactly. It's your life, blah, blah, blah. You know, it's a different animal. So, but she didn't object to it. I was scared to death, sitting, 3 rows behind her as she was watching it.
You're afraid she's gonna give you an F.
or give me the eye or something. But Billy Ruth Loving was with us as well. She came down, and but she said she enjoyed it, and I think she was happy with it at that time.
How did you like, what did you think of Renee Zellweger's performance?
I think she liked Renee's performance. You know, originally we flew Vincent down to Louisiana to meet Novalyne before we started filming. This is probably early 1995. And Renee was not cast at that point. We had Olivia Dabo, who was going to play Novalyne. And Olivia came down with Vincent to meet Miss Ellis, and we met, we had a whole interview and everything, and had a great time. And then when we got back to Los Angeles, about 2 months later, Dan Ireland calls me and says, "Hey, I got some news. Olivia Dabo's pregnant." And I'm like, "That's not good." And he goes, "Oh no, it's okay because she says she can do it. We'll just have to, make sure that she's, we can't tell that she's pregnant." And I go, "Dan, we're going to Austin, Texas, in the middle of summer in August, outside in these locations. What do you think's going to happen?" And he's like, "Well, maybe you're right." So we had to call her and tell her, "Sorry, we got to start looking for someone else." And our casting director, named Laurel Smith, said, "I got this girl. You got to see. I think she'd be perfect." And that's when Renee walked in and read and was like,
And she just done Jerry Maguire?
No, that was way after.
Really?
The only thing she'd done at that point was she was in Dazed and Confused. She'd done a movie called Shake, Rattle, and Rock, and she'd done Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 or something like that. She was not known. She was not known. But she came in. We knew she was from Katy, Texas, and she came in and blew us away. And that's how she got it. And we were there. 2 months later, we were shooting in Austin. And Renee did get to meet Miss Ellis too, because Miss Ellis came up. I call her Miss Ellis, Novalyne, to meet Renee as we were shooting, and they had a nice visit while we were there. And that's how that happened.
Okay, for the second part of your question, there's probably a lot of different interpretations about why it didn't work. I know Rusty Burke has said that they were in love with each other, just not at the same time. And you can see that interaction in the book. When she's waxing warm, he's pulling away. When she's leaning away, he's leaning in, like he needs something. And how much of that is her interpretation of the relationship versus what actually happened, we don't know, because she is the primary source for their relationship.
Because I was going to say that aspect of the book made me feel that she did not romanticize. She wasn't colored by some romantic, and I want to say that after making my comment before about the impact of a past relationship. I felt like she thought a lot about it. She probably overthink about it. I mean, women are very analytical about why relationships are working or not working. So I think she probably thought very hard about it and tried to be realistic about it. That's the impression that I got, and how complicated and it was.
Well, I've always thought, and this is just a simplistic idea about the two people, and I've always thought that Howard was kind of a man who stood apart from the crowd, and where Novalyne wanted to be a part of the crowd, but be above the crowd. So it's a different dynamic. And that's kind of why it didn't work. They were the same, but they were different. Because she wanted to be respectful and be respected, but I don't think Howard necessarily had all of that going for him. He stood apart from everybody. She still wanted to be accepted, but that's my dynamic on the whole relationship. I don't know if you agree with that or not.
Well, that sounds like a lot of relationships between strong women and male writers, and maybe vice versa as well. But it sounds like a dynamic that happens a lot, because a man will want to be who he is, and a woman will be like, "Hey, but we have to get along in society a bit.
Right,
We can
exactly,
be, you can still be strong, but we have to still at least play the game a little bit."
Other questions?
And of course, that was in the middle 1930s, and it was a lot different then.
I'm curious, did Novalyne have any input into the script, or did you go directly from the book?
I just went direct. I went directly from the book. The first draft was like 200 pages, and we started whittling it down. And but she didn't have any input in the screenplay. But I mean, if you've seen the movie, you know, I didn't really fudge too much in that. There are some scenes I wrote, some conversations that I kind of wrote that I thought would be appropriate. But there's a lot just directly out of the book because it was just too good. I couldn't keep it out. It's like, you know, I'm going through it, I'm outlining stuff and what I want to keep, and there's so much there. It was easy because you're cutting stuff that's great and leaving stuff that's great. So yeah, it was. She didn't have any input in the screenplay, but it's not like I'm writing something from scratch. The source material was so good, I didn't have to alter it very much at all.
Yes, a very faithful question.
Yeah, I know that in most states before World War II, you couldn't be married as a female teacher. And if you were, when you got pregnant, you had to quit. It was only when there was lack of manpower shortage that women could teach after that. Do you think that played any role in their relationship? The fact that if she was going to get married, then she would be able to teach anymore?
No, because she was still married as a teacher in Louisiana in the 40s.
Yeah, but that was after World War II.
That was the 40s, that was after World War II, but while there was a stigma against married women working in the workforce, it wasn't cut and dry. I don't believe it was the law in Texas at the time. That might have been the expectation of society. There were certainly issues about that in the 1930s and beyond, but she never brings it up. And you would think that if it was such a critical issue, it would have gone in the book. And she doesn't bring it up, so I don't think that's a huge issue. I'm not going to rule it out, but there's a question back there.
We got Ernie in the back.
Yeah.
A question talking about the breakup. Is it possible that this is actually, we get to see part of Bob's actual understanding of the world, that he was barbaric and she was civilization?
Oh.
I didn't actually hear that question very well.
Okay, so the question was, in the breakup with Novalyne Price Ellis, was Bob the barbarian and was Novalyne civilization? Do you want to answer that one, Patrice?
Yeah, I can try. So at the beginning, at the exact moment of the beginning of the relationship with Novalyne, he wrote Beyond the Black River. So I guess, and he was already writing about the barbarian and civilization. So if that relationship had helped him answer the kind of question, he would have written Beyond the Black River after he was done with her, not as he was dating her.
And I would just say that the whole conversation of barbarian versus civilization was something he had been having with H.P. Lovecraft in his correspondence since 1930. So that was definitely in his head. Whether it had anything to do with the breakup, we have no way of knowing. I think we have time for one final question.
I have a question about the diaries that probably don't exist but possibly did. If they were to be dropped on your table, like right now, how does that work? Because she said they were destroyed, and so she probably would not wish anyone to ever read them. So where do you go with that?
So we don't know about that. Supposing the diaries exist, I've been talking with Marvin, so that's Novalyne's son, and what could the possible scenarios be depending on what we find in those diaries. And so I'm not going to go into those details, but we have different scenarios ready in case we find the diaries.
Yeah, right. One more.
Very quick related to that. If in fact Don Grant had 100 pages cut, where are those 100 pages?
I've tried to find them. I was hoping to find them in Glenn's paper in 2016 or 17. Couldn't find them.
And with that, I think that's all the time we have. Thank you, everyone on the panel.